All right, strap in everyone, because today we're going deep on retinoid and vitamin D receptors.
Yeah, these little guys, they control a lot more than you might think.
I mean, I know they're important.
They're like the behind-the-scenes crew for some really essential stuff happening in our bodies.
Okay, so give me the rundown. Remind me, what exactly do retinoid and vitamin D receptors do?
Well, they're like the conductors of this big orchestra, right? Retinoid receptors, they're all about vitamin A,
Yeah.
and they're calling the shots for things like how cells grow, how they become different types of cells.
Like differentiation.
Exactly. Even your vision relies on them.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize.
And then you've got the vitamin D receptors.
Yeah, vitamin D, that's all about bones, right?
Yeah, bone health is a big one. They make sure you're absorbing enough calcium.
Right.
But they're also kind of multitaskers. They're involved in immune responses, even how cells grow and change.
Really? So they're kind of like busybodies involved in everything?
You could say that.
Okay, but how do they actually do all this? Do they just like float around until they bump into a vitamin?
Not quite. They've got a system, see. They bind to specific DNA sequences. We call them response elements.
Response elements.
Think of them as like docking stations.
Okay.
So retinoid receptors, they look for these rares.
Rares.
Yeah, retinoic acid response elements, it's a mouthful, I know.
It is a bit of a mouthful.
And vitamin D receptors, they're searching for VDREs, vitamin D response elements.
Ah, so it's like a lock and key kind of thing.
Exactly. Each receptor knows exactly where it needs to go.
Okay, so they find their docking station, their response element, then what?
Well, that's when things get really interesting, because when a retinoid or vitamin D receptor binds to its response element, and here's the catch, only when it's also bound to its vitamin, it sets off this chain reaction.
A chain reaction.
And this can either turn genes on or off.
So it's not just the receptor doing the work. It needs the vitamin to flip the switch.
That's the key. The vitamin or hormone, it acts as a ligand.
A ligand.
Yeah, it basically binds to the receptor and changes its shape.
Interesting.
And that shape-shifting is critical because it allows the receptor to bring in other proteins, these co-regulators. And those are the ones that really drive the action, turning those nearby genes on or off.
So it's like a relay race. The vitamin starts it, the receptor grabs the baton, and then these co-regulators bring it home, turning genes on or off.
Perfect analogy.
I like that, the relay race.
And the type of co-regulators, those determine whether a gene gets turned up or silenced.
Okay.
Some act like activators, boosting the gene's expression. Others are repressors. They hit the brakes.
Ah, so it's a real balancing act.
It is, and it's happening all the time in your body.
Wow. This is incredible. These tiny molecules are directing this whole complex dance of gene regulation.
It's a pretty amazing system.
Can we look at a specific example to see how this plays out in real life?
Sure, let's take bone remodeling.
Bone remodeling.
Vitamin D receptors, they're key players in this process.
All right, so I'm guessing vitamin D binds to its receptor and...
Then, boom, it triggers a cascade of events.
Cascade.
It activates genes that build up bone.
Okay.
And it represses the ones that break bone down.
So vitamin D, through its receptor, it keeps that balance between building and breaking down bone.
Exactly. And that's essential for healthy bones throughout your life.
Wow, this is starting to click.
Good.
But we've been talking about these receptors generally. Are there different types of retinoid and vitamin D receptors?
Oh, yeah, it gets even more nuanced.
I figured.
For example, with retinoid receptors, you've got RAR and RXR.
RAR and RXR.
They have different preferences for retinoids, and they often work together to regulate gene expression.
So like different players on a team.
Exactly, each with their own strengths and strategies.
And what about those thyroid hormone receptors, the TRs we talked about before? Do they fit in here?
They absolutely do. TRs are structurally very similar to retinoid and vitamin D receptors.
Oh, interesting.
They're all part of this big family, the nuclear receptor superfamily. It's a superfamily.
A group of proteins that basically act as transcription factors, controlling which genes are turned on and off.
It's fascinating how nature uses these common building blocks, these receptor families, to control so many different things in the body.
It really is efficient.
So we've got these retinoid and vitamin D receptors. They bind to DNA. They team up with vitamins. They control gene expression. It's a lot to take in.
It is a lot, but it's all connected.
And it all boils down to this process called transcription.
Right. Transcription, it's basically like copying a gene's DNA sequence into a messenger RNA molecule.
Messenger RNA.
Yeah, and that mRNA, it's like the blueprint for building proteins.
Ah, proteins, the workhorses of the cell.
You got it.
So these receptors and their ligands, they're ultimately in charge of this whole copying process.
Exactly. It all starts with those response elements, those landing pads. for the receptor-ligand complex.
Okay.
And once they're bound, they bring in other proteins, those co-activators or co-repressors we talked about.
And those guys, they interact with this huge protein complex called RNA polymerase.
RNA polymerase, that's the one that actually makes the RNA molecule, right?
Right on. And depending on which co-regulators are there, this complex can either help or block RNA polymerase from doing its job.
So it's like having a construction crew. Sometimes they're given the green light to build, sometimes they're told to stand down.
That's a great way to put it.
But I'm still a little confused. How do these receptors know where to go in the first place? How do they find the right genes?
That's the beauty of their structure. They have specific domains, regions that recognize and bind to those DNA sequences, the rares and VDREs.
So the receptor structure is like a GPS, guiding it to the right spot on the DNA.
It is. And then the presence or absence of the ligand, the vitamin, determines whether it flips the switch on or off.
This is amazing. It's like a whole world of activity happening inside our cells.
It is, and we're just beginning to understand it.
This is really fascinating stuff. We've covered a lot, but there's so much more to explore.
Oh, definitely. We're just getting started.
Well, I'm ready to dive deeper, but maybe we should take a quick pause.
Sure, let's regroup and then come back for more.
Sounds good. We'll be right back.
All right. Okay, so we were talking about these retinoid and vitamin D receptors.
Yeah, fascinating stuff.
And one area I find particularly interesting is how they impact immune function.
Oh, that's right. We were going to get into
That's like they have this hidden talent for managing our body's defenses.
I know vitamin D is supposed to be good for immunity, but how do these receptors actually affect our immune cells?
Well, think of immune cells like specialized soldiers, each
Yeah.
with their own role to play.
Okay.
And retinoid and vitamin D receptors, they're kind of like the trainers, getting those soldiers ready for battle.
So like drill sergeants for the immune system.
Exactly. They help those T cells develop and differentiate.
T cells, those are the ones that target specific threats, right?
You got it. The key players in adaptive immunity.
So how does that work? Are we back to those response elements and co-regulators?
You know, it's the same basic mechanism, but now it's happening in immune cells.
Okay.
Retinoid and vitamin D receptors, when they're bound to their ligands, they can bind to response elements near genes that control how T cells develop and function.
So they're fine-tuning the immune response by tweaking those genes.
Exactly, like adjusting the balance between different types of T cells.
What do you mean?
Well, you've got T cells that promote inflammation,
Right.
and others that dampen it down, and that balance is crucial.
I can see how that would be important.
You need enough inflammation to fight off infection, but not so much that it starts harming your own body.
It's all about finding that sweet spot.
Exactly, and these receptors help maintain that balance.
They're like master conductors, making sure the immune system plays the right tune at the right time.
That's a great way to put it.
But with all this control, I'm wondering, can these receptors ever cause problems? Can they go rogue?
That's a really insightful question, and unfortunately, the answer is yes.
Oh, no.
Like any complex system, things can go wrong.
Makes sense?
Disruptions in retinoid or vitamin D receptor signaling, they can contribute to a whole host of health issues.
Like what kinds of issues?
Well, for retinoid signaling, problems can lead to skin disorders, vision problems, even developmental defects.
And vitamin D receptors?
Dysregulation, there has been linked to autoimmune diseases, bone disorders, even cancer.
Wow, that's serious stuff.
It is. It all comes back to the balance. Too much or too little activity can tip the scales towards disease.
This reminds me of what we were talking about with thyroid hormone receptors and how mutations in those receptors can cause conditions like RTH.
Yeah, it's similar.
It seems like these nuclear receptors, while they're essential, they can also be vulnerable points in our biology.
Exactly, and that's why ongoing research is so important in this field.
Absolutely.
The more we learn about these receptors and how they function, the better we'll be able to develop treatments for all sorts of diseases.
Okay, so we've talked about the roles of retinoid and vitamin D receptors in different processes,
Right.
and how disruptions in their signaling can lead to disease.
Uh-huh.
But I'm still a little fuzzy on how those mutations actually mess up receptor function.
Okay, sure.
Can we revisit that using one of these receptors as an example?
Sure. Let's take vitamin D receptors and bone health.
Okay.
Remember how we talked about them regulating calcium absorption for strong bones?
Yeah.
Well, mutations in the vitamin D receptor gene can cause a condition called vitamin D-resistant rickets.
Rickets, that's a bone disease, right?
Exactly. It's where bones become soft and weak, often leading to skeletal deformities.
Oh, wow.
And in vitamin D-resistant rickets, the problem isn't a lack of vitamin D.
Hmm.
It's a defect in the receptor itself.
So even if there's enough vitamin D in the blood, the body can't use it properly because the receptor isn't working right.
Precisely. And this just highlights how crucial these receptors are in translating those external signals, those vitamins and hormones, into actions within our cell.
It's like having a communication breakdown. The message gets lost.
That's a great analogy.
And those breakdowns, they can have serious consequences for our health. All right, so we've covered retinoid and vitamin D receptors,
Yeah.
their roles in all of these processes and
Mhm.
how things can go wrong.
Right.
But you mentioned earlier that they're part of a bigger family, the nuclear receptor superfamily.
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating group.
Can we unpack that a bit? What makes these receptors so special?
Well, they're all transcription factors directly regulating gene expression,
Right.
and they share this common structure with specific regions for binding DNA, binding ligands, and interacting with co-regulators.
So it's like they're all built from the same basic blueprint.
Exactly, but with different modifications and attachments that allow them to specialize.
Like a Swiss Army knife, each tool has its own function.
Perfect analogy.
But with so many different nuclear receptors, how do they avoid getting their signals crossed?
That's a great question.
How does the cell make sure the right receptor responds to the right signal?
It's all about specificity, those DNA binding domains. Each receptor type recognizes and binds to a unique set of DNA sequences, ensuring it only regulates its target genes.
So each receptor has its own secret code, a specific DNA sequence it's looking for.
Exactly. And that code, along with the specific ligand binding properties, makes sure only the correct signals trigger the right gene expression changes.
This is amazing. The level of precision and coordination is incredible.
It really is. The more we learn about these molecular mechanisms, the more we appreciate the elegance and efficiency of biological systems.
Well, this has been an incredibly enlightening deep dive so far.
It has been.
We've explored retinoid and vitamin D receptors, their roles in all these processes, and we've touched on this amazing world of nuclear receptors and how they control gene expression.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
But I know there's still more to uncover.
Oh, definitely. We've only scratched the surface.
All right, let's keep going with these retinoid and vitamin D receptors.
Yeah, we've covered a lot.
But I feel like there's still so much more to learn. What other interesting things about these receptors should we explore?
Well, we've been focusing on how they work inside the cell.
Right, binding to DNA, controlling genes.
But there's another layer to consider, how these signaling pathways interact with each other.
Wait, they don't just work alone.
Nope, there's crosstalk between different systems.
Crosstalk.
It's like a city with multiple transportation networks. They all intersect and influence each other.
Ah, so it's not just one receptor doing its own thing.
Right, it's a whole network of signals.
Okay, I'm following you.
So how does this crosstalk actually work?
Yeah, give me an example.
Okay, let's look at retinoid and vitamin D receptor signaling.
They both have different roles, right?
Yes, but they often collaborate, like in-cell differentiation.
Interesting.
They might even have opposite effects, one promoting differentiation, the other inhibiting it.
So it's a tug of war between signals.
Exactly, a delicate dance to determine the fate of a cell.
And that balance is crucial.
Absolutely. Too much of one signal, not enough of another, and things can go haywire.
So it's like those co-regulators we talked about, but now it's entire pathways acting as co-regulators for each other.
That's a great way to think about it.
It's getting pretty complex.
It is, but that complexity gives our cells incredible flexibility.
Okay, so we have these complex networks of signals
Yes.
interacting, influencing each other.
And ultimately shaping our health.
Are there any vulnerabilities in these networks where things can go wrong?
That's a good question, and unfortunately, yes, disruptions can lead to a variety of diseases.
Oh, no.
One area that's particularly interesting is the connection between retinoid and vitamin D receptor signaling and the immune system.
I remember we touched on that earlier.
Right, both receptors play key roles in regulating immune responses.
How so?
They influence the development of immune cells, the balance of inflammatory signals, even the activity of immune-related genes.
So if those pathways get messed up, it could throw the whole immune system off balance.
Exactly. It could lead to all sorts of immune-related disorders.
What kind of disorders?
Well, for example, dysregulation of vitamin D receptor signaling has been linked to autoimmune diseases.
Autoimmune diseases, that's where the immune system attacks the body itself, right?
Right, and alterations in retinoid signaling can be involved in inflammatory disorders and even cancer.
Wow, so these receptors have a much bigger impact than I initially thought.
They really do. It goes far beyond cell differentiation and bone health.
And it just highlights how important research is in this area.
Absolutely. The more we understand these networks, the better we can develop treatments for these diseases.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive.
It really has.
We've gone from the tiny details of these receptors to the vast complexities of cellular signaling.
It's amazing how these tiny molecules have such a profound effect on our health.
It really is, and I'm sure there's still so much more to discover.
Definitely, we've only just begun to scratch the surface.
So, what are your final thoughts on all of this?
For me, it's the elegance and efficiency of these systems that's most impressive.
Okay.
The way these receptors act as gatekeepers, taking in all these signals and translating them into instructions for our cells.
Yeah, it's like a perfectly choreographed dance.
Exactly, and it makes you appreciate the power of evolution to create such sophisticated solutions.
I couldn't agree more, and it's clear that there's still so much left to explore.
Oh, definitely.
So to everyone listening, what questions has this deep dive sparked for you? What rabbit holes are you eager to go down? Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep into the amazing world of molecular biology. Until next time.